What happened to the Ford Aurora after the World's Fair? 50 million people saw it. Newspapers called it the car of tomorrow. Families stood in line for hours just to peek inside. It had a roof that turned from clear glass to solid metal at the push of a button, 12 tiny headlights that could light up a highway like daylight, and a back door so elaborate it made loading kids look like something from a science fiction movie. This was the Ford Aurora, the most talked about vehicle at the 1964 New York World's Fair. But here's what nobody tells you. The moment those fair gates closed for the last time, the Aurora vanished. Completely disappeared. For decades, people assumed Ford had destroyed it, crushed it, melted it down for scrap like they did with so many other dream cars. But they were wrong. The Aurora survived. And what happened to it, where it went, what Ford did with all those revolutionary features, and why this incredible machine spent decades hidden away where almost nobody could see it, that's a story that reveals secrets about how the auto industry really works. Secrets Ford didn't want you to know. I'm talking about missing components that disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Engineering breakthroughs that vanished into corporate vaults. Revolutionary features that could have changed everything but somehow never made it to your family's driveway. And here's the question that haunts automotive historians to this day. Was the Aurora killed by technical problems, by cost concerns, or by something else entirely? Something Ford has never publicly admitted? You're about to find out what really happened to the most advanced station wagon ever built. You're going to learn which Aurora features secretly made it into production cars without anyone noticing. You're going to discover why Ford stripped this vehicle down and what they were looking for when they did it. And you're going to see evidence that suggests Ford might have had reasons beyond money for making sure the Aurora's most radical innovations never reached the public. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we can solve the mystery of what happened after the fair, you need to understand just how significant this vehicle was when 50 million people first laid eyes on it. Because the Aurora wasn't just another concept car. It was a promise. A promise Ford made to America. And what Ford did with that promise, well, that's where this story gets really interesting. The World's Fair moment. Before we can understand what happened after, you need to grasp just how significant the Aurora was during the fair itself. The 1964 New York World's Fair wasn't just another car show. This was a massive international exposition that ran for 2 seasons, 64 and 65, attracting over 50 million visitors. Ford invested heavily in their pavilion, and the Aurora was the centerpiece of their practical dream cars display. Think about the context. This was the height of America's optimism about the future. Space race enthusiasm was everywhere. Families were embracing technology. The station wagon had become the symbol of suburban family life. Ford's timing was perfect. The Aurora sat on a rotating platform where visitors could walk completely around it. Ford representatives stood nearby explaining the features, and the crowds were mesmerized. This wasn't just a pretty show car. Ford had actually built 23 experimental features into this vehicle, and most of them actually worked. The polarizing roof really did change from transparent to opaque. Those 12 mini headlights really did provide variable illumination. The clamshell rear entry system really did operate. People could see it functioning right there on the display floor. Newspapers and magazines covered it extensively. Motor Trend published detailed articles. Popular Science featured the Aurora. Even mainstream newspapers that rarely covered concept cars wrote about this one because it captured people's imagination about what family travel could become. But here's what made the Aurora different from most concept cars. Ford presented it as practical technology, not distant fantasy. They weren't saying, maybe in 50 years. They were suggesting these features could appear in showrooms within a decade. That promise made what happened next even more significant. Because when the fair ended and the crowds went home, the Aurora was about to take a very strange journey. The fair ends, now what? So the World's Fair closes in October of 1965. The crowds go home. The pavilions start coming down. And somewhere in all that activity, the Ford Aurora gets loaded onto a transport truck. But where was it going? For most concept cars of that era, there were really only 3 possible destinations. First possibility, the crusher. Yes, many concept cars were simply destroyed after their display life ended. They'd served their publicity purpose, and keeping them around was expensive and created liability concerns. Parts suppliers wanted their experimental components back. Storage space was costly. So plenty of concepts met their end in scrapyards. Second possibility, Ford's design studio archives. Some special concepts were preserved for historical purposes or continued engineering study. These would end up in storage facilities in Dearborn, carefully maintained as part of Ford's heritage. Third possibility, the show car circuit. Some concepts continued doing promotional duty, appearing at auto shows, dealer meetings, and special events for years after their debut. Each destination would tell us something different about how seriously Ford took the Aurora's innovations. So which fate befell the Aurora? Here's where the story gets interesting and a bit mysterious. Ford didn't immediately announce what happened to the car. There was no press release saying Aurora goes to museum or Aurora retired to archives. It simply disappeared from public view. For years, automotive historians assumed it had been destroyed, just another concept car that served its purpose and was scrapped. But they were wrong. And when the Aurora finally resurfaced, what investigators discovered raised more questions than it answered. Jump forward to the early 1970s. A car enthusiast visiting the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn notices something interesting in one of the storage areas. It's a futuristic-looking station wagon, dusty and partially disassembled, but definitely the Aurora. Word spreads through the automotive history community. The Aurora survived. But it wasn't on display. It was in storage, tucked away with dozens of other vehicles, not particularly well cared for and certainly not celebrated. This discovery raised more questions than it answered. Why was it hidden away? Why wasn't it on display with other significant Ford vehicles? What condition was it really in? Investigators who got access to examine it found something revealing. The Aurora had been partially stripped. Some of the experimental components were gone. The polarizing roof mechanism had been removed. Several of the electrical systems were missing. The television and communications equipment from the central lounge had disappeared. It looked like Ford had cannibalized the Aurora for parts or study after the fair ended, then stored what remained. This wasn't unusual. Many companies dismantled concept cars to study the components or reuse expensive experimental parts. But it suggested Ford hadn't initially planned to preserve the Aurora as a complete historical artifact. They treated it as an engineering test bed that still had utility even after its show days ended. The discovery sparked some interest in automotive circles, but the Aurora remained in storage, rarely seen by the public. Decades would pass before its story took another turn. But here's what matters. While the Aurora sat forgotten, something fascinating was happening with its technology. Some of those revolutionary features were quietly making their way into production vehicles. Just not in the way Ford promised. What features actually made production? While the Aurora itself sat forgotten in storage, something interesting was happening with its innovations. Some of those 23 experimental features actually did influence production vehicles, just not in the ways Ford originally presented. Let's track what made it and what didn't. The polarizing roof? Never made production. Too expensive, too complex, too many failure points. But the idea of controlling cabin light influenced later sunroof designs and the development of tinted glass options. Those 12 mini headlights? Never happened. But the concept of variable lighting intensity and better light distribution absolutely influenced headlight development through the 70s and 80s. Modern adaptive headlights owe a debt to that Aurora thinking. The clamshell rear entry system? Too complex and too expensive for production. But elements of it appeared in later wagon designs. The fold-down tailgate that became a step was adopted by several manufacturers, just without the sliding roof portion. The soundproof rear compartment for children? Never made production as designed. But the idea influenced the development of better cabin noise insulation and the later trend toward rear entertainment systems in family vehicles. The electroluminescent lighting for safety and identification? Too expensive and unreliable for 1960s production. But it pointed toward LED lighting technology that would eventually dominate automotive lighting decades later. Here's the pattern. Ford's engineers learned from the Aurora. They identified which technologies were genuinely useful versus which were just show features. The practical innovations influenced future development even if they didn't appear exactly as presented in the Aurora. But many of the most dramatic features, the ones that wowed World's Fair crowds, never came close to production because they solved problems families didn't actually have or cost far too much for the benefits they provided. So was Ford dishonest when they presented the Aurora as practical technology? That question becomes even more troubling when you learn what happened during the restoration discussions. What happened to the Ford Aurora after the World's Fair? By the 1990s, automotive historians and enthusiasts were asking loudly, why doesn't Ford restore the Aurora? The concept car had undeniable historical significance. It represented an important moment in American automotive design, a tangible piece of the era when American optimism about technology seemed limitless. And Ford certainly had the resources to restore it properly. They'd restored plenty of other vehicles. They had skilled craftsmen. They had the funding. So why not the Aurora? But restoration wasn't simple, and the deeper you looked, the more complicated it became. Remember, the Aurora had been partially disassembled decades earlier. Some components were gone entirely, removed for study or reused in other projects. The polarizing roof mechanism, the Aurora's most celebrated feature, would need to be completely rebuilt from scratch. The original engineering drawings existed somewhere in Ford's archives, but could modern craftsmen even recreate the mechanism using those 1960s specifications? Finding vacuum tubes and relays that were obsolete by the 80s would be a monumental challenge. The electrical systems presented another massive hurdle. The Aurora used technology that was cutting-edge in '64 but laughably primitive by '90s standards. Restoring it to original specification meant tracking down components that hadn't been manufactured in 30 years. Upgrading it with modern electronics would be easier but would compromise the vehicle's authenticity. Which approach was correct? There was also a deeper philosophical question that divided restoration experts. Restore it to what condition exactly? Should it be returned to its World's Fair appearance, pristine and fully functional, looking exactly as it did when millions of people first saw it on that rotating platform? Or should it be preserved as it existed when placed in storage, partially stripped, showing the honest truth of what happened after the publicity ended? Or perhaps it should be kept exactly as found, with decades of dust and deterioration visible, telling the complete story of neglect and rediscovery? Each approach told a different story. Each had passionate advocates. A World's Fair restoration celebrated the Aurora's moment of glory. An as-stored preservation acknowledged Ford's engineering study of the vehicle. An as-found preservation told the harder truth about how the industry often treats concept cars after their usefulness ends. Ford's official position seemed to be straightforward but frustrating. The Aurora simply wasn't worth the substantial investment a proper restoration required. They had dozens of other concept cars and significant vehicles competing for the same limited restoration funds. The original Mustang concept. The GT40 racers. Production vehicles that had actually shaped Ford's commercial success. The Aurora, while undeniably interesting to specialists, wasn't a production vehicle. It hadn't influenced Ford's bottom line. It hadn't sold a single car. It was a fascinating footnote, not a headline in Ford's story. This calculus seemed cold to enthusiasts, but it reflected business reality. Every dollar spent restoring the Aurora was a dollar not spent on vehicles with clearer connections to Ford's heritage and commercial success. Was it worth spending perhaps $300,000 or more to restore a vehicle that represented promised technology that mostly never materialized? So the Aurora remained in storage, a fascinating relic that most people couldn't see and Ford wasn't particularly interested in celebrating. Its very existence was acknowledged, but barely. Automotive journalists would occasionally request access to photograph it, and sometimes Ford granted permission, sometimes not. The interest was clearly there in the enthusiast community, but Ford's enthusiasm remained distinctly absent. Articles would appear periodically in specialty automotive magazines asking about the Aurora's status, speculating about its condition, wondering if restoration might ever happen. These pieces would generate reader interest, letters to Ford, requests for action. But nothing changed. The Aurora stayed in storage, slowly deteriorating further, losing more of its original components to time and entropy. That situation would finally change, but not until well into the 21st century, when a new generation took control of Ford's heritage programs. And when Ford finally acknowledged the Aurora publicly again, what they revealed was both surprising and, in some ways, disappointing. Something fundamental shifted in Ford's thinking during the 2000s, though exactly what triggered the change remains unclear. Maybe it was the retro design trend sweeping through the automotive industry, with manufacturers mining their heritage for inspiration and credibility. Maybe it was growing mainstream interest in mid-century modern design, with the 1950s and 60s aesthetic suddenly fashionable again in everything from furniture to architecture to automobiles. Maybe it was simply new people in charge of Ford's heritage collection, younger executives who'd grown up hearing stories about the Aurora and saw value in celebrating it that their predecessors had missed. Whatever the catalyst, the Aurora started appearing in public again. Not fully restored, not looking anywhere near World's Fair condition, but at least acknowledged as an important part of Ford's history. It showed up in special displays at the Henry Ford Museum, positioned alongside other concept vehicles and dream cars from the same era. It appeared at selected automotive events, always with explanatory placards detailing its World's Fair history and its 23 experimental features. Automotive journalists were finally allowed regular access to document it properly, and the photographs that emerged told a complex story. The images showed a vehicle in rough condition but still unmistakably recognizable as the Aurora that had captivated World's Fair crowds. The body was intact. The fundamental structure had survived decades of storage. The distinctive proportions were still evident. You could see the lines that had looked so futuristic in '64, even though they now looked dated in an entirely different way. But decades of storage in varying conditions had taken their inevitable toll. Chrome trim that had gleamed under World's Fair spotlights was now pitted and corroded. The paint, which had been pristine and glossy, was now faded and chalky, showing the oxidation of decades. Interior materials, the fabrics and plastics that had seemed so modern and durable in the '60s, had deteriorated badly. Vinyl had cracked. Foam padding had disintegrated in places. The carpeting was stained and worn. Missing components were obvious gaps in the design, empty spaces where experimental equipment had been removed and never replaced. The polarizing roof mechanism was completely gone, leaving just the structural framework. The 12 mini headlights were missing from their housings. The television and communications console in the central lounge was an empty cabinet. The elaborate clamshell rear entry system was frozen, neither the tailgate nor the sliding roof section functional anymore. Decades of disuse had seized mechanisms that had once operated smoothly for impressed World's Fair visitors. Still, even in this deteriorated condition, the Aurora impressed people who saw it. The sheer ambition of the design was still evident. You could look at the vehicle and understand what Ford had been trying to achieve, even if most of those achievements had never reached production. The size and proportions remained striking. This wasn't a small show car built on a shortened wheelbase. This was a full-size station wagon, built to realistic dimensions, showing that Ford had at least initially intended these features for actual family vehicles. The innovative features, even when non-functional and incomplete, showed remarkable creativity and engineering sophistication. The polarizing roof mechanism, based on surviving documentation and photographs, had been genuinely advanced for its time. The variable headlight system represented real thinking about how to improve nighttime visibility. The rear compartment design showed Ford had actually considered the realities of traveling with children. This renewed visibility sparked fresh discussions in automotive publications and among enthusiasts about concept cars from the 1960s. The Aurora became a frequent example in conversations about innovation versus practicality, about how the industry approaches future technology, about the persistent gap between show cars and production reality. These discussions revealed interesting divisions in how people interpreted the Aurora's legacy. Some critics argued forcefully that the Aurora represented everything wrong with concept cars: impractical features that dazzled crowds but had no real-world utility, technologies that never matured beyond the prototype stage, promises made to the public that were never kept and perhaps were never intended to be kept. To these critics, the Aurora was essentially a lie, a publicity stunt disguised as genuine innovation. Others saw it quite differently, as exactly what concept cars should be: ambitious explorations of possibility, unconstrained by immediate production reality, allowing engineers and designers to push boundaries and discover what might be possible even if most of it ultimately proved impractical. To these defenders, the Aurora succeeded precisely because it dared to imagine a different future, even if that future never arrived. Both perspectives had genuine merit and reflected honest differences in how people thought the automotive industry should operate. The Aurora was simultaneously too advanced for its time and not advanced enough, too impractical for real-world use and yet full of genuinely good ideas that eventually influenced production vehicles in subtle ways. The Aurora's story after the World's Fair teaches us something important about automotive innovation. Here's the first lesson: most concept car features don't make production, and that's okay. The Aurora's 23 experimental features represented hundreds of thousands of dollars in development costs. Maybe 3 or 4 of those ideas genuinely influenced later production vehicles. That's not failure. That's exploration. Companies need to try ambitious ideas to discover what works. The second lesson: practical beats dramatic almost every time. The Aurora's most dramatic features, the polarizing roof, the 12 mini headlights, the elaborate rear entry system, those never made production because they were solutions looking for problems. Families didn't need roofs that changed transparency. They needed reliable vehicles that didn't break down. The third lesson: concept cars serve multiple purposes. Yes, they explore technology, but they're also publicity tools, morale boosters for engineering teams, and statements of corporate ambition. The Aurora succeeded at those purposes even though most of its features never reached showrooms. The fourth lesson: preservation matters, but it's expensive. Ford kept the Aurora instead of destroying it, and that was the right choice. But full restoration would have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars for a vehicle that wasn't crucial to Ford's heritage story. Resources are limited. Choices must be made. The fifth lesson: timing matters more than technology. The Aurora appeared at exactly the right moment, the height of American technological optimism. 5 years earlier or later, and it might not have captured public imagination the same way. That perfect timing at the World's Fair gave it lasting significance. These lessons apply beyond just the Aurora. They help explain why the automotive industry works the way it does, why brilliant concepts often disappear, and why the gap between show cars and showroom cars remains so large. But there's still one question left. Where exactly is the Aurora right now? Section 9. Where is the Aurora today? So where exactly is the Ford Aurora right now? The answer is, it depends on when you're asking. The Aurora has spent most of its post-World's Fair life in Ford's storage facilities in the Dearborn area. Sometimes it's been at the Henry Ford Museum's storage areas. Sometimes it's been in Ford's own archives. It's been moved around multiple times over the decades as storage needs and organizational priorities changed. As of the last reliable reports, the Aurora remains in storage, unrestored but intact. It's not on permanent public display anywhere. It occasionally appears in special exhibitions, but those are rare and typically require advance arrangements. The vehicle's condition remains essentially as it has been for decades, structurally complete but missing components, showing age and wear, not functional but recognizable. Ford has never announced plans for a complete restoration. The cost would be substantial, and the Aurora competes with dozens of other significant vehicles in Ford's collection for limited restoration resources. Vehicles with clear production connections or greater historical impact typically get priority. Does this mean the Aurora will remain in storage forever? Probably not. Interest in mid-century concept cars continues growing. The specific design era the Aurora represents, that early 60s optimism about technology and family life, has nostalgic appeal. Eventually, whether through Ford's efforts or through transfer to another museum or collection, the Aurora will likely receive the restoration and display it deserves. But that day hasn't arrived yet. For now, the Aurora remains what it's been for most of its existence. A fascinating footnote in automotive history, important to specialists and enthusiasts but not quite significant enough to receive full preservation treatment. It's an unfortunate fate for a vehicle that once represented Ford's vision of the future. But perhaps that's exactly the fate it was always destined for. The Ford Aurora's journey from World's Fair sensation to storage obscurity tells us something melancholy about innovation and memory. 50 million people saw this vehicle. Newspapers celebrated it. Families dreamed about owning something like it someday. And then, almost immediately, it was forgotten. Ford moved on to other projects. The public moved on to other dreams. The Aurora became the past's vision of the future, which is always a bit embarrassing for everyone involved. But here's what shouldn't be forgotten. The Aurora represented something valuable. It showed that Ford's engineers and designers could think boldly about what family transportation might become. They imagined features that seemed impossible and then built them, even if only for display. That spirit of ambitious exploration, that willingness to push boundaries and try radical ideas, that's what made the American automotive industry great in the 1960s. The Aurora failed to predict the actual future. Most of its features never appeared in production vehicles. The future of family transportation turned out to be minivans and SUVs, not elaborate station wagons with polarizing roofs. But failure to predict the future doesn't diminish the value of trying. Every Aurora feature that didn't work taught Ford's engineers something useful. Every technology that proved too expensive or impractical helped them understand real-world constraints. The Aurora earned its place in history not because it succeeded, but because it tried. So what happened to the Ford Aurora after the World's Fair? It became a teacher, a reminder, a cautionary tale, and an inspiration, all rolled into one dusty, partially disassembled package sitting in storage. Maybe that's exactly the legacy a concept car should have. What do you think? Should Ford restore the Aurora? Does it deserve display alongside Ford's production vehicles? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into automotive history, the sources are linked in the description. Thanks for watching.